Hello everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the most important cornerstone of solo gameplay, Bosco. Hands down, accurate and efficient use of Bosco is the most important and powerful element of playing solo. I'm not exaggerating when I say Bosco completely trivializes some of the mission types in the game. So knowing the power that you're sitting on top of every time that little boy loads into the mission with you is incredibly important. And one of the reasons Bosco is just so strong is that there's really no skill required to utilize him. No offense. The only two ways that you really interact with Bosco in the average mission is left-clicking with the laser pointer in your hand and pressing X. Whenever the laser pointer is out and you left-click, that's a contextual sign for Bosco to tell him what to do. If you click on a bug, he'll attack it. If you click on a pipeline, he'll build it. If you click on a quark buried in the wall, he'll mine it out. And same goes for any other mineral in the wall, he'll mine it out into chunks. We'll go over to the exact things that Bosco can do in more detail in a moment, but if you ever have him doing one of these tasks and you need him to return to you at a moment's notice, you can always press X to do so. And just to be clear, whenever I say X, I mean X button on the keyboard. This is the button that is your shout key that says, hey, over here, whenever you press it. So to go over the contextual actions that Bosco can do that we touched on earlier. Everything that's mineable in the game, like air cubes, gold chunks, quarks, morkite, nitra, can all be mined by Bosco. When it comes to heavy objects, once he reaches it and it breaks through the wall, he'll pick it up and carry it towards you. And you can make him drop it or throw it to you by pressing X. If you do press the shout key whenever Bosco's within 10 meters of you carrying a heavy object, he'll actually throw it in an arc towards your position. This happens even if you're not looking at him. So if you're fighting bugs, you can actually press the button to have Bosco throw you a heavy object at the same time. Some really good multitasking. And when it goes to heavy objects that are already out of the wall, you can always left click on them to have Bosco go pick them up and carry them until you tell him to drop them or take them off his hands. Now let's talk about combat. While you can left-click a bug to have Bosco attack that enemy specifically, he will automatically attack enemies once they come into your area. Also, if you get grabbed by a cave leech or a trawler or a grabber, Bosco will prioritize on attacking that enemy. Thankfully, he has pretty good logic and doesn't actually attack Corlocks until you aggro them yourself, but his attacks can hit them if another bug lures his fire that direction. Though those instances are quite rare. Just be aware. If you're ever down in a solo mission, Bosco will come over and revive you, consuming one of his revives. By default, Bosco has 2, and that can be increased up to 4 via the upgrades for Bosco. We'll talk about those in a moment. Additionally, whenever Bosco does revive a down player, all enemies will be feared away, kind of like how a field medic revive works. Next we have lighting. Very simply put, whenever you left click on something that isn't mineable or killable, Bosco will fly over near it and illuminate a bright light. This light can also be upgraded via Bosco's upgrade tree. Next we have build/repair. This only comes up in refinery missions. Essentially, once you've run out the framework for a pipeline, you can use Bosco to stretch out the internals of that pipe, or as we refer to it, building the pipe. And once you're actually pumping on a refinery mission, Bosco can be pinged on the pipeline to repair the broken linkages. A cool little fact that I didn't know for a long time is you don't actually have to ping really anywhere close to where the pipeline needs to be built or repaired. Up to 2 links away, you can ping the pipeline and Bosco will still figure out what you want him to do, which I thought was pretty neat. Next we have a pretty niche one, which is guard. This only exists in 2 niche situations, which is Doretta and Haxi. If you left click on Doretta or Haxi, Bosco will prioritize attacking enemies that are attacking Doretta or Haxi. I generally just keep him floating around me rather than pinning him onto Doretta, as it generally produces the same result, but it could definitely make you have some more peace of mind, assuming that Bosco is actually focusing on the objective. And lastly, a specific interaction that was introduced for Season 3 is vacuum. When it comes to cleaning up contagion spikes, there's a 2-step process, spraying the foam onto it and then vacuuming it back off to eliminate the infection. Bosco does the second half of this. The logic on this was pretty poor early on in the season, but I find it's quite reliable these days, and Bosco will actually consistently get all of the foam that you've laid down. Just pay attention, as you might have to give him some help in finding little bits and pieces that are scattered around. And one of the unlockable mechanics of Bosco's mod tree is rockets, which you can fire by holding the laser pointer and pressing right click. Now let's go over Bosco's mod tree. Alright, we're going to jump around Bosco's mod tree a decent amount because there's a lot of nuances in the way that the tiers interact with each other that makes a lot of difference. So first we'll talk about Tier 2 because it's the only tier on Bosco where there's no choice. This is where you unlock rockets. Aside from massively decreasing the readability of Bosco's stat card, this upgrade adds 2 regeneratable rockets onto Bosco as a form of secondary weapon. These are utilized by right-clicking whenever you have the laser pointer in your hand. Unupgraded, these rockets do 120 area damage in a 2.5 meter area. They have a base armor break value of 100% and no fear by default. Each rocket you fire will slowly regenerate over the course of 90 seconds. So before we move on any further, I want to talk about base rockets. Unfortunately, there's no way to actually upgrade the damage on a rocket, which isn't too big of a deal because the base damage of them actually hits the normal grunt one-shot breakpoint. However, that's the only thing that it does. That, and considering the way that damage fall-off works in this game, you will most likely not be one-shotting more than a few grunts in any given swarm. For this reason, most people don't consider the base rockets very good, and even more unfortunately, most of the upgrades that can be applied to the rockets don't do much to redeem them. There's one upgrade in particular that does make the rockets quite good, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But just keep in mind that as we go through that, whenever we're talking about upgrades that improve the rockets in their normal function, we consider that the rockets are pretty middling as is, so those upgrades become massively less valuable due to that. Now let's go ahead and jump to Tier 5. We have 3 mods to choose from in this tier. 2 of them are based around Bosco's rockets, and 1 are based around his normal weapon. Let's talk about the 2 that are based around the rockets first. First, we have Bigger Explosion, which nearly doubles the AoE, increasing it by 2 meters. Pretty simply does what it says on the tin. It increases the area where damage will be done, which also indirectly increases the amount of area that is done the full damage of 120, so indirectly this increases the area where you can one-shot a grunt. Next we have Fast Regeneration. This more than halves the rocket regen speed, all the way down from 90 seconds to 40 seconds. If you are interested in using Bosco's rockets quite heavily, this is the go-to. And last, we have Overcharged Rounds. This gives a 30% chance on every bullet the Bosco fires to electrify the target enemies. And while electricity isn't that useful as a status effect in this game, I will say that having an infinite supply of it and a constant barrage of it is quite useful, especially whenever you're using Bosco to target certain enemies. Because of this mod alone, bulk detonators are basically a non-threat in solo as their speed is massively cut down simply by you pinging them and sending Bosco after them. For this reason, pretty much everybody, and myself included, takes overcharged rounds in Tier 5. Now we'll talk about the 3 Tier 4 upgrades, which are all based around Bosco's rockets. First we have Fear the Rocket. This applies a 50% fear factor onto all rockets fired. Fear is quite a complicated mechanic, and I won't try to explain it in its entirety here. You can read more about it on the DRG wiki if you'd like to get the nitty-gritty of it, but basically it adds the ability to do fear onto Bosco's rockets. Now we have High Frequency Explosion, which massively increases the armor breaking of Bosco's rockets, to the point that it basically shreds all armor that it hits. Not a bad upgrade by any means, but generally speaking, armor break isn't as valuable as most upgrades that it competes with. And unfortunately, that is generally true in this mod tier as well. As far as armor break goes, this is one of the most potent sources of it. Even if it is on a very long cooldown, whenever it hits, it definitely hits. And lastly, we have Cryo Explosion. As the stat card doesn't really reflect this correctly, it basically removes all damage from Bosco's rockets. However, it inflicts cold temperature on the enemy's hit instead, as well as increasing the base radius. If you know anything about status effects in this game, you're probably well aware that Cryo is basically second to none when it comes to overall potency. And Bosco's ability to bring Cryo to every class, including ones that don't have access to it naturally like Engineer and Gunner, is so incredibly valuable. Unfortunately, due to a recent tweak, it's no longer reliable to freeze NATO site breeders with Bosco's Cryo rockets, but that being said, they're still incredibly useful against Nexuses, Spitball Infectors, and just general hordes of enemies. Speaking with broad strokes, you're going to get far more mileage out of cryo rockets than you will out of normal explosive rockets. And for this reason, most people take cryo rockets in this tier, which renders basically all the other rocket upgrades on Bosco, except for one, largely useless. And that one we'll talk about shortly. Now we're going to talk about Tier 1 and Tier 3 at the same time, so I apologize for any confusion, but I think it's very important that you consider both of these tiers at the same time while speccing Bosco. Let's start with Tier 3 since it's generally less impactful. First you have Let There Be Light. This gives a massive bonus to the light radius of Bosco's light ability. to a point that it basically illuminates all medium-sized caves instantly as soon as you ping a non-mineable surface for him. It makes it vastly easier for all classes aside from Scout to quickly get the lay of a room, see all the valuables, and move on. As I just implied, this upgrade is massively less useful if you're playing Scout, as you naturally have the flare gun with you regardless, but on any other class it's very useful. Next we have an extra revive. It does exactly what it says on the box. It allows you to be revived by Bosco one extra time. And lastly, we have a third rocket, which is pretty straightforward as well. Bosco has a max capacity of 3 rockets, and of course starts the mission with 3 rockets. This doesn't do anything to help with the regeneration time though. Now before we pick a mod in tier 3, we're going to jump up to tier 1. First we have high velocity rounds, which is a straight up 50% damage increase to Bosco's normal fire. Generally, you shouldn't be relying on Bosco to do all the damage in a fight, and largely just using him to pick off swarms of smaller enemies. Generally, against them, increased damage isn't going to do too much to let him cut through them faster, and generally he gets the job done in time anyways. But if for some reason you really need Bosco to pull more weight, then I can definitely recommend high velocity rounds. 50% damage increase is nothing to shake a stick at, even when it is as little as 4 to 6 damage. Next we have another extra revive, exactly the same as tier 3. And finally, we have Mining Expert, which massively increases the rate at which Bosco can dig all minerals, extract items from the wall, dig through dirt. Just doing everything that involves his mining ability is massively boosted. So now let's talk about these two tiers when looking at them side by side. Mainly thinking about revives. The easiest way to answer this question is to say, well, just don't die, dummy, and you'll never need the extra revives, forehead. Well, that's not always the case, especially when you're learning to play solo. So if you're terrified of losing missions when first starting out playing solo, I'd highly recommend you taking both revives in both tier 1 and 3. This brings you up to a total of 4, and if you're really worried about losing missions, you can also take Iron Will on your class, which will give you an effective 5th revive. Personally, I find this overkill for even new solo players, so I'd recommend you, even if you start at this point, constantly evaluate how many times you're dying and ratchet it back and take better upgrades on Bosco. So, if you only want 3 revives on Bosco, where should you change your mod? But this kind of begs the question of, if you only take 1 revive mod, where should you take it? Now this is a very hard question to answer, but generally I consider the first tier much more valuable in its other choices than taking the revive there. Either taking high velocity rounds or Mining Expert is generally going to get you more value than a brighter light or 1 extra rocket. So if you're only taking 1 revive, I'd recommend taking it in tier 3 to start. And once you do finally get comfortable and want to stop taking any revives on Bosco, you can switch off to light or the extra rocket in tier 3. Tier 3 is pretty subjective in my experience, as I see plenty of skilled players using the extra rockets. However, I consider the light a slightly nicer quality of life, and I often forget to use Bosco rockets personally. So personally, I take the light in tier 3, but taking a 3rd rocket isn't a bad choice, and it'll definitely give you more mileage in combat than the light will. And also, needless to say, if you're playing Scout in solo, you definitely shouldn't be taking the extra light and just take the extra rocket. Though personally, I'm too lazy to come over to the Bosco terminal and switch between light and the extra rocket constantly, so he just runs light even when I'm playing Scout. And generally speaking, in broad strokes, no matter what class you're playing, I would always take Mining Expert in tier 1. Like I said, if you really need Bosco to pull double duty to make up for a damage deficit in your build, like if you're playing an unpromoted class, then maybe take high velocity rounds, but even then, it's generally a better choice just to get through the missions faster by taking Mining Expert instead. So as far as debatable mod choices, tier 1 and 3 are always going to be up in the air, but when it comes to the other tiers like 4 and 5, I don't really see the alternatives as being very useful in my experience. If Bosco's rockets were just buffed at a baseline level, then it would definitely lend a lot of credence to the mods in tier 4 and 5 that buff the rockets, but as it stands, most classes can pull significantly more weight just by themselves rather than pulling out the laser pointer and trying to get Bosco to do something. And the occasional cryo rocket can help you deal with a Spitball or a Brood Nexus. That said though, I wanted to put together a build for all different kinds of Bosco playstyles. So as we kind of discussed earlier, there's the full revive Bosco, which is 2-1-2-3-3, which is taking both revives, cryo rockets, and electricity in tier 5. The Pit Fighter, which is taking all the combat related skills, which is damage in the first tier, the extra rocket in tier 3, and then armor breaking rockets and faster recharge. And then my normal Bosco spec, which I call the Hyper Helper, which is faster mining, brighter light, cryo rockets, and electricity in Tier 5. Whoa, that was a lot, but I think that just about covers everything for Bosco. I hope you enjoyed. If you'd like to talk to me or any of my community members, you can find us over on Discord. If you'd like to catch me live, I stream over on Twitch. If you'd like to join, become a YouTube member, get your name in the credits of every video along with some other perks, you can check out the join button down below. And as always, thank you for watching, and have a nice day.